People believe that if you're just the passenger, you're safe, that the traffic stop isn't really about you, that as long as you weren't driving, you're just a bystander in someone else's inconvenience. And I'm going to tell you something that might make you uncomfortable. The passenger is often the reason the stop gets longer, deeper, and more dangerous. I have watched hundreds of body camera videos, sat through suppression hearings where every word spoken on the roadside gets dissected under fluorescent courtroom lights, and I can tell you this with complete certainty. The moment a passenger forgets one simple boundary, the entire dynamic changes. The stop shifts, it expands, it breathes in more time. And in criminal law, time is everything. The phrase I want you to remember, the phrase that anchors everything we're about to talk about, is this: I'm just a passenger, and I don't consent to any searches. That sentence, delivered calmly, respectfully, and without attitude, is the difference between a 10-minute traffic stop and a 40-minute roadside investigation. Now here's where this gets complicated. When a police officer pulls over a vehicle in the United States, the law treats that stop as a seizure under the Fourth Amendment, not just of the driver, of everyone in the car. The Supreme Court made that clear in Brennan v. California. The court said passengers are seized too. You don't have to be driving to be legally detained. If the car is stopped, you're not free to leave unless the officer says you are. And that sounds protective, right? It sounds like the law recognizes your rights as a passenger. But here's the twist. The same case that gives you standing to challenge the stop also places you squarely inside it. You're not a spectator. You are part of the scene. This is where it turns. Officers are trained to control uncertainty. A traffic stop is one of the most unpredictable environments in policing. They don't know who you are. They don't know what's in the vehicle. They don't know if there are weapons, warrants, or drugs involved. So they control what they can: movement, conversation, and time. And passengers often give them more of all three. I've seen it over and over again. The officer approaches the driver's window, asks for license and registration, and before the officer has even finished the first sentence, the passenger leans across the center console and says something like, "We weren't speeding," or "Why did you pull us over?" Or worse, starts explaining where they're coming from. That's the passenger mistake that extends traffic stops. It's not illegal to talk. It's not a crime to ask questions, but conversation is fuel. Every additional word creates new threads for the officer to pull. In court, we call it expanding the scope, and it almost always begins with voluntary dialogue. Let me paint the picture more clearly. An officer pulls over a car for a broken taillight. That's a valid reason. Under Wren v. United States, even minor traffic violations justify a stop, regardless of the officer's subjective intent. The broken taillight is enough, so the officer walks up. The driver is nervous, but quiet. The stop, if it proceeds normally, is a citation and done. But the passenger, feeling defensive or perhaps simply uncomfortable in silence, says, "Is this because we were in that neighborhood?" Or maybe the passenger says, "We're just coming back from my cousin's house. Nothing weird." Now the officer hears neighborhood. The officer hears nothing weird. Those phrases, harmless to you, are red flags to someone trained to detect inconsistency. Why mention it if nothing is wrong? Now the stop isn't just about a taillight. Now the officer may ask, "Where exactly were you?" And the driver's answer might not perfectly match the passenger's. Not because anyone is lying, but because humans rarely give identical spontaneous accounts. That tiny inconsistency becomes reasonable suspicion, and reasonable suspicion is the legal threshold that allows the stop to be prolonged for investigation. This is the trap. Passengers think silence looks suspicious. They think talking clears things up. In reality, talking introduces variables, and variables create suspicion. Under Rodriguez v. United States, officers are not allowed to extend a traffic stop beyond the time needed to handle the traffic violation unless they develop independent, reasonable suspicion of other criminal activity. That case matters. It sets a boundary. But here's the part most people misunderstand. Reasonable suspicion is a low bar. It's not proof. It's not even probable cause. It's articulable facts, combined with rational inferences. And courts give officers wide latitude in describing what they observed: nervousness, avoiding eye contact, over-talking, inconsistent travel plans, the smell of marijuana, furtive movements, Those two words alone have justified countless vehicle searches, and passengers generate many of those articulable facts without realizing it. I represented a young man once who was sitting in the front passenger seat during a late-night stop. The driver had a valid license. The vehicle was registered. The stop began as a simple lane change violation. My client did something that, on its face, was completely understandable. When the officer asked the driver where they were headed, my client jumped in and said, "We're going home." He said it quickly, almost protectively. The officer later testified that the passenger appeared overly eager to answer, that he was breathing rapidly, and that he looked back toward the rear seat multiple times. That became the basis for ordering everyone out of the car. Once outside, the officer claimed he smelled marijuana. A search followed. A firearm was found under the passenger seat. In the suppression hearing, the prosecution leaned heavily on the passenger's behavior, his words, his tone, his movements. The judge ruled that the officer had reasonable suspicion to extend the stop. That's how thin the line can be. Now let me be honest with you. Silence is uncomfortable. Being stopped by police triggers adrenaline. Your heart rate spikes. Your mouth gets dry. Your mind starts racing through worst-case scenarios. That physiological response is normal. It's not guilt. It's survival instinct. But officers are trained to interpret those physiological responses as potential indicators of deception. They're trained to watch hands, shoulders, breathing patterns. They're trained to notice who speaks first. This is why the central phrase matters. I'm just a passenger, and I don't consent to any searches. Notice what it does. It clarifies your status. It asserts a boundary. It does not accuse. It does not argue. It does not escalate. It simply defines the legal line. Here's where this gets complicated again. As a passenger, you are not required to provide identification in most states unless the officer has reasonable suspicion that you committed a crime. Some states have stop and identify statutes, but even those typically require reasonable suspicion tied to you personally. Being in a car that was pulled over does not automatically obligate you to hand over ID, but if you start answering questions about travel plans, ownership of items, or who has what in the car, you are now participating in the investigative portion of the stop. You are creating a record. And body cameras capture tone, timing, hesitation. This is where officers use ambiguity and psychological pressure. They might say, "If you've got nothing to hide, you don't mind if I take a quick look, right?" That's not a command. It's a request framed as a moral test. Or they might separate driver and passenger and ask the same questions twice, looking for discrepancies. The passenger mistake isn't just talking, it's volunteering. It's trying to manage the situation socially rather than legally. You are not there to win rapport. You are there to protect your boundary. Now, this is the part most people misunderstand. Asserting your rights will not make the stop pleasant. It may make it longer in the short term. Officers may respond with more scrutiny. They may call for backup. They may ask you to step out of the vehicle. Under Maryland v. Wilson, officers can order passengers out of a vehicle during a lawful traffic stop for officer safety. So when you assert, "I'm just a passenger and I don't consent to any searches," you must be prepared for inconvenience. That's the hard truth. Rights are not magic spells. They are shields, and shields sometimes invite pressure. But pressure is not the same as legality. If an officer lacks reasonable suspicion and prolongs the stop anyway, that issue becomes critical later in court. Judges analyze timelines. They review body cam footage. They examine whether the questioning measurably extended the duration beyond what was necessary for the traffic violation. And guess what often sinks suppression motions? The passenger's own words, creating the very suspicion the officer needed. Body language matters more than people realize. Keep your hands visible. Avoid sudden movements. Don't whisper with the driver. Don't reach into bags without explanation. If you need to move, say calmly, "I'm going to reach for my seatbelt." Officers are human. They assess threat first, legality second. If they feel uncertain, they slow everything down. And here's something else. Sometimes officers already suspect something before they approach the vehicle. Maybe it's the time of night. Maybe it's the location. Maybe it's prior knowledge of the area. The traffic violation becomes the doorway. What they're really looking for is confirmation. Passengers often provide it. When you speak unnecessarily, you help build narrative. And once a narrative forms in an officer's mind, confirmation bias does the rest. Every movement fits the story. Every glance supports the suspicion. If, after you assert your phrase, the officer continues to question you, you can repeat calmly, "I'm just a passenger, and I don't consent to any searches. I'd like to remain silent." You do not have to debate. You do not have to justify. If they ignore you and continue searching anyway, do not physically resist. Do not argue roadside law. Your courtroom is later. Your job in the moment is composure. I've stood next to clients who insisted they did everything right except for one small thing. They kept talking. They tried to smooth things over. They thought honesty would end it faster. Sometimes it does, but when it doesn't, those words become evidence. The passenger mistake that extends traffic stops isn't dramatic. It's subtle, it's conversational, it's human, and that's why it's dangerous. Because in that quiet moment on the side of the road, under flashing lights, with adrenaline in your bloodstream and authority standing at your window, the instinct is to explain. Instead, remember the boundary. I'm just a passenger, and I don't consent to any searches. Say it calmly. Say it once. Say it again if necessary. Then stop. Rehearse it in your mind until it feels natural, until the words don't tremble, until your breathing stays steady. Because the time to figure out what to say is not when the lights are already in your rearview mirror. The passenger is not invisible. The passenger is part of the legal equation. And the smallest mistake, a volunteered sentence, an unnecessary explanation, an attempt to appear helpful, can shift the stop from routine to investigative. Time is everything in a traffic stop. Don't donate yours. Rehearse the phrase until it becomes automatic. Because when adrenaline hits, you won't rise to the occasion. You'll fall to your level of preparation.